Hello and welcome everyone to AMS Weather Band's latest webinar. It is Spring Season Review Won't Be Forgotten Anytime Soon with Rachel Hogan-Carr and Greg Carbon, and moderated by Doug Hildebrand. Now, before we begin today, I would like to address some of the guidelines for our webinar. First, if you have any questions during the webinar, please put them in the Q&A in the bottom of your screen. It's a little button to the left of the chat button. Questions for speakers submitted there. We'll keep an eye on that and make sure that we are addressing those questions as they come up. Please avoid the chat. Anything in there will most likely not be looked at and addressed. So yes, we'd like to concentrate all of your concerns or questions in the Q&A section down there. We will also have some specific time for questions from the audience after the presentation, but we may answer some questions as the presentation progresses, depending upon the flow of the event. So now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. So thank you, Rachel, Greg, and Doug, for joining us. First of all, our moderator, Doug Hildebrand, is the National Weather Service Preparedness and Resilience Program lead, leading the Weather Ready Nation Ambassadors, Storm Ready, and Skywarn programs. He is also the AMS chair of the Weather Band Committee, pardon me, a member of the newly established Committee on Spirituality, Multi-Faith Outreach, and Science, and a former commissioner of the Weather, Water, and Climate Enterprise Commission. With 20 years of experience in the National Weather Service, Doug has held various roles, including as a communications specialist, a policy advisor, and a research and innovation lead. He has brought together organizations to achieve success and reduce lightning deaths, and added committees and drafted AMS statements during his time as an AMS commissioner. Doug holds a BA in geology from Bucknell University, a master's in geology from University of South Florida, and a master's in meteorology from North Carolina State University. Rachel Hogan-Carr is the executive director and a founding member of Nurture Nature Center, Inc., a nonprofit organization based in Easton, Pennsylvania, specializing in flooding and hazard education and risk communication. Rachel and her research team have conducted numerous social science studies that have contributed to the improvement of National Weather Service flood and forecast products. Rachel has led impactful initiatives such as the award-winning Focus on Floods campaign and the establishment of the Create Resilience Hub. Additionally, she is a certified floodplain manager and an adjunct professor at Lafayette College teaching social entrepreneurship. Greg Carbon is the chief of forecast operations at NOAA's National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center in Maryland. With over 20 years of experience, Greg has held various roles within the NWS, including serving as the warning coordination meteorologist at the Storm Prediction Center in Oklahoma. He has been recognized for his groundbreaking work on severe weather climatology and has received the Theodore Fujita Research Achievement Award from the National Weather Association. Greg's expertise and leadership contribute to the issuance of crucial forecasts for rainfall, snowfall, and medium-range weather across the nation. And with all that being said, I turn it over to you, Doug. The floor is yours.
Good time to take a breath there, Gideon. Thanks so much. Such a distinguished, set of panelists here, speakers. And I want to welcome everybody. I want to start my quick remarks sort of explaining the title of this webinar. Obviously, it's the spring seasonal discussion, and just for sort of a broader perspective, we are looking within our Weather Band Committee of hosting these every 3 months, talking about the previous season. So this is sort of the first, or some can consider the second seasonal discussion. Greg was a part of a panel during our Jamposium this spring on the winter season. And so now we're reflecting back on the spring season and, coming up with sort of that second tagline of won't be forgotten soon. There really wasn't a singular event where people are going to be thinking back to spring 2023, but it really was a smorgasbord of hazards, of high impact events, the pace and frequency of these events. And it really didn't seem to let up. There may have been a lull or two, but consistently through March, April, May, into June, and really continuing here in the summertime, high impact events, societal, bad news almost daily. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Greg. And I also just want to mention that, with the recent rains, the flooding rains in Vermont, Greg has a close tie, he and his family, to Vermont. And then Rachel Hogan Carr in Easton, Pennsylvania, not that far from the flooding just a couple of days ago this weekend, that seems to have some tragic ends as well. Greg, take it away.
All right, thanks, Doug, and thanks, Gideon, for the great introduction, and hello to Rachel as well. So the weather's like not stopping, and I was just describing to Gideon how we're trying to come up with new adjectives almost every other day to describe what we're experiencing so far this summer. I've written up a recent narrative, so when we get to summer, I'll be ready. But I had to go back and remember what exactly happened in March, April, and May, and I didn't have a lot of time for that. But I'll share my slides here for today, and we can begin to review. So I did some of these slides kind of quickly over the weekend because I was working over the weekend on the rainfall events plaguing the Northeast U.S. But at the top row here, you see loops of the month, the daily summary charts from the National Weather Service Weather Prediction Center, what we call the National Forecast Chart. So for every day, I have a script that'll just run and make the loop. And you can see how active it is based on, the colors on the map, so to speak. The red being the flash flood risks, the yellow being the severe weather risks, white being snow or winter weather, and the dark gray, which you see show up quite often in the southern plains, is critical fire weather. Now, those daily maps are going by pretty quick. There's a lot of events there, which we'll get into for every month here coming up. At the bottom row is basically the Esrill, the physical science laboratory that NOAA runs, looking at the anomalies at the upper levels, the 500 millibar level, for the entire month of March on the far left, April in the middle, and May. And it's kind of interesting. I was just looking at this. You can really see a change in the pattern as we went from March into April. The pattern for March there is one that is really supportive of active severe weather regimes, and we saw plenty of severe weather outbreaks. April was maybe this kind of transition between the deep trough in the west, and then May comes along, and you see this hugely anomalous upper level ridge in aggregate for the month of May, centered across Canada. And we all know that is basically the one of the ingredients to support dry weather and the start of wildfires up there. So we went from this very active March pattern into an April pattern that remained relatively active, because April is usually that transition month that you'll see a lot of severe weather and flooding, and then into May, which is something completely different. And I would say that the pattern that we've seen now into the summer months, the ridge persists in Canada, but it has come back with a vengeance across the southern United States. So let me go to the next slide here. This is going back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go for every month. We'll just take a look at the National Centers for Environmental Information summaries. This is for March. And the snow continued in the Sierra and the Great Basin area for March. They had incredible snowfall amounts out there during the West throughout the season. 58 feet or over 56 feet recorded at the Central Sierra Snow Lab in California. And again, the severe weather in red, the red box, over 110 tornadoes confirmed at the end of the month. 8 EF3s resulting in loss of life, unfortunately, and widespread damage. And then an unusual mid-March winter storm, unusual for the entire winter across the Northeast. And I just put a couple of images in here depicting each of those 3 highlights for the month of March. The snowfall in the West, it caused problems with infrastructure and very difficult to clear that amount of snow. And the severe weather outbreak at the end of the month, and then the very interesting nor'easter that brought some pretty heavy snow late. They don't like to see snow in March. It's at the end of the winter up there. Interior parts of New England actually had a pretty decent winter snow-wise. Moving on, oh, well, not moving on. They just look a little more detail at the snow, the seasonal snowfall accumulation across the western United States here, starting in October and through November, through December, through January, February, and into the end of March, into April, actually. The white there in the Sierra is over 50 feet of snowfall, but you can also see how many areas of the Great Basin, the higher elevations across the west, picked up 40 to 50 inches. And then we had a very popular tweet from WPC showing the daily maximum snowfall record event reports. And interestingly, that daily maximum number there across parts of the interior West, Wyoming, up into the Great Lakes, also corresponds where we saw seasonal snowfall exceed all past seasons, at least for the past 14 years. That's what this map in the lower right shows, just the exceedance from any other season when we look at this past season. So the West had snow, the East did not. That was pretty much the story of the end of winter there in March. In April, basically, it's going to focus here on the big rainfall event that caused a very busy few days for the Weather Prediction Center here. Fort Lauderdale on April 13th had an incredible rainfall event that continued from late afternoon into the evening hours. Basically, an inch an hour fell at the airport in under 24 hours, about a 1,000-year recurrence interval on something like that, and a record rainfall of 14.59 inches. It broke the 14.59 inches. It's almost doubling the rainfall from the prior all-time record there. And that's what the airport looked like at the end of the event or the following day. And I have a loop here showing the accumulation by hour. This is just I think it's a 12 or 13 hour loop, and it just shows you the maximum, the rainfall that occurred, 18 inches in a little over 12 hours there. And again, this is from the Office of Hydrologic Prediction here, showing the return interval on a 12-hour rainfall amount. Just amazing, a bullseye of a 1,000-year return interval there. A 0.01% probability of occurring in any year. So very rare, very extreme, and it just happened to be co-located with a very populated area. So that was a memorable event for April. Moving on to May, we'll wrap it up here. Heat advisories started early in the month, and you saw, remember the 500 millibar map showing the upper ridge across south central Canada. Well, that upper ridge brought a lot of heat and dry weather to parts of the Northwest and the plains. So heat advisories started early in the Pacific Northwest, record-breaking temperatures over parts of the Northwest, and very dry conditions across parts of the plain states, the central plains and Great Plains, having very little rainfall through the month of May, or March through May, it says on this graphic here. And that's what it looked like as far as the temperature anomaly. And that's a mid-month average for the month of May. So incredibly warm. And again, the start to many of the wildfires that are now resulting in the smoke and can still burn up there. And it's very unfortunate. We're not even really at the peak of the burning season, and the pattern up there does not look to change anytime soon. So that's unfortunate because all that smoke is headed our way. And this is a look at the fires. There's a loop I put together basically for the second half of the month of May, basically the last week and a half or so, showing the onset of the wildfire activity up there across parts of British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Alberta. And then not long after this, we saw fires really start to crank up even in Quebec, parts of Ontario. So we'll go into June here. So I thought May was the end, but we're moving into June. The highlights here was rather cool Northwest flow across the Great Lakes and Northeast during this period of time. The heat started to really come on in the South. And we had a heat wave cause temperatures to soar above 100 degrees. Del Rio reached 113 during the month, San Angelo 114, and unfortunately that heat wave continues here in the second half of July. More than 8 inches of snow fell in Mount Washington in June. There was a real cold snap. I was up in New England during the month of late May into early June, where it was rather cool before they started getting very wet up there. So June was again kind of this transition to the pattern we're seeing now, with heat continuing across the southern U.S., basically west or northwest winds across the northern tier, bringing smoke from Canada across the Great Lakes and the Northeast. So we've got a lot of things going on. And that brings us to the end of my slides here. I want to thank NCEI for putting these summary slides together. We've been really focused on heat and extreme rainfall for the past few weeks, and every day brings a new challenge. So I'll pass it back to you, Doug.
Great, thanks, Greg. And we're a little bit flexible on what constitutes spring, whether we're looking at it from climatological spring or astronomical spring. So great that you included June as well. So I want to pass it off to Rachel here, who's going to broaden our perspective and really highlight some points that hopefully will lead into greater discussion. Rachel.
Okay, are you able to see me and hear me and see the slides?
Looks and sounds good, Rachel.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. Really delighted to be here. And I thought I would build on a bit of what Greg just talked about, in the sense of how we think about and talk about the fact that the weather, I mean, there's that long joke, everybody talks about the weather but doesn't do anything about it. But talking about the weather seems to be the biggest thing happening this spring. It's conversation. And I want to look a little bit about how we digest and communicate that risk all around the frame of how we're experiencing people talking about normal and what is normal now and what we do about that. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Nurture Nature Center, if you come to Easton, Pennsylvania, and please do, we have a beautiful center where you can take in some science, art, and community dialogue events about local and global environmental issues. We have NOAA's Science-on-a-Sphere there. We were formed in response to flooding in the Delaware River Basin, and our town has a tendency to find itself underwater as well. And so we were born, honestly, of the issue of flooding. And what most people know of our work in this world is our role in doing social science research to advance understanding of how people use forecast information, and specifically flood forecast information. So for the past 12 years, our research team has worked with National Weather Service offices across the country, both national offices as well as local and regional offices, to test and revise and advance the forecast products so that they work better to communicate risk. So that's the world I'm used to thinking about. How do forecast products motivate? But there's more to that story that I want to talk about. The slides that you see here are kind of the bread and butter, the meat of what we're often looking at when we talk about forecast products and how people receive information. And this is the lens we often think about. The upper left-hand corner is a dramatic personal plea from an emergency briefing from a weather forecast office during Superstorm Sandy. And the middle is the significant river flood outlook product that we tested in an early study back about 10 years ago, looking at some spatial mapping of the potential for significant river flood outlook. We also see some bar and whisker probabilistic plots. And then you see a series and evolution of probabilistic flood or hydrologic forecast products, including some variations that we tested out in focus group based on the kinds of feedback we got from people about how they understand probabilities and the spread of things. So this is where we're often thinking about how people gather information. But today I really want to talk about, to broaden that a little bit and just throw out there for the rest of the conversation, kind of three considerations for thinking about the spring events. And there's one that I just reviewed, which is how that forecast is communicated. But then there's this other issue entirely of how the media discusses the issue. And that includes forecast information, but it also includes cultural information. It includes dramatic graphics. It includes whether or not we're discussing the preparation and the recovery and the event, or if we're just discussing the day of the event itself. And then really importantly, I think, is how we share the information ourselves as residents, as people living in neighborhoods, as people living in communities. What is it that we're actually sharing with each other about all of this information that's coming at us constantly through forecasts and through media? How are we discussing this, and what are we doing about normal? And so I was thinking about the kinds of events I knew that Greg was going to be talking about, and thought about how this spring, probably more than ever, it seemed like there were lots of visualizations to try to show us things we hadn't seen or understood before. So here are a couple of viewers. The one on the left is an animated GIF from NASA Worldview that our science director put together for me for this, that shows the smoke from the Canadian wildfires. And on the right-hand side, almost a beautiful artistic rendering from NESDIS of the scope of the smoke as well. So here you get the kind of the global context of where these events are coming from. And these are more and more common for people trying to understand what's happening. And then there's the series of products that look more like this, that are designed using colors and categories and data points to really hone in on the more local conditions of what's happening. So on the left-hand side, we're seeing the particulate concentrations from June 5th through the 8th in the Northeast, really record-breaking for the communities there in the population centers to be having those kinds of, particulate matter. And here you're seeing that more traditional forecast categorical kind of representation from good up to hazardous, right? With color scales that we're used to seeing for perhaps extreme rainfall events or heat maps for temperature events. And then on the right-hand side, we have an experimental product that is the air quality forecast guidance, which is kind of like a pick your own pollution number kind of map, which I think works really great. So you can hone in exactly where you are and see the AQI for the location where you are, and get a sense from the color bar also whether or not the gradients are showing levels of concern. And the graphic that I took here was from about 2 or 3 days ago when we were looking pretty good. And then subsequent to this, the numbers turned a lot less well for me here in Pennsylvania. I had another busy day. But really, I mean, wow, when the smoke hit the Northeast, when it hit the media center, where the media markets are located and where it hit the population centers of the country, the imagery and blanketing coverage, pardon the pun, it was totally intentional. When the smoke hit home, this became the story, right? And everybody wanted to understand this was, never seen before in this area. California wildfires get coverage. Canadian wildfires, we get coverage. We're aware that they happen, but when it hit the media markets, I think the coverage really took off. So you see the range of photographs and weather forecasts. And in the lower right, I noticed that's Chris Stapleton's concert got canceled. I'm a fan of his, so I got included in there. But this is just a random sampling of how intense the visual scenes that we saw were. And there's a lot to be asked about, the intensity of this coverage versus when it's happening in California or when it's happening in Canada. To use that word that's debated in the weather world, it truly was unprecedented. So it makes a bit of sense that we saw this. But the collective effect that I noticed that was really profound was that between that coverage, between the lived experience of the smoke and between the forecast products explaining what was going on, overnight here in the Northeast, the idea of checking your air quality became normal. Something we never really do unless you're in a community that has some bad, exhaust pollution. But on a regular basis, people were talking on the streets about where the AQI was. People were talking about airnow.gov. They were sharing this graphic on social media. And the number was spinning way up to 300 plus, right? We were in the 300s. We were in the darkest color. We couldn't see through it. And it reset the level of what normal was okay, right? So after 300, when it came back down, it was normal for a little while. About a week later, it jumped back up to 160. And somebody said to me, well, where are we at now? And I said about 160. And we both went, okay, right? That's okay. We can go out in 160, right? And that number 2 weeks prior to the events would have been really problematic. We would have said, why is our air quality so bad? But so quickly we recalibrated. But underneath all that, people are saying, but is this normal? Is this okay? Is this going to keep happening? Are these fires going to keep happening this way? Is this part and parcel of our life now? Is this normal? And what we learn to tolerate and accept as normal is just changing. And similarly with the intense rainfall events, you think of the major events that really shocked the world, like Katrina and some of the big events like Harvey, but increasingly there's so many high impact rainfall events that the coverage of them comes in and swoops in, and it's flashy and it's intense. And the forecasting involved is tremendous and complicated and has so many forecast products. And then we don't hear much about it. So if you look at Fort Lauderdale flooding that Greg described, there was a really wonderful, for anyone who's interested in this, story map that the Miami Weather Forecast Office did. And I'm not sure, can you see this story map that says Fort Lauderdale? Did it change, or are you still seeing my slides?
It didn't change, Rachel.
It didn't change? Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, I'm going to just share screen for a second. Now do you see it?
Yep.
Yep, okay. So this is a story map that the Miami Weather Forecast Office put together, which is really spectacular, describing what happened in that Fort Lauderdale event. And I got kind of really lost in it. And it goes through an event overview, a meteorological setup, and impacts and overmap, talks about the social media and communication that they did throughout the event to understand it. And for those of you who are interested in thinking about where people really get their information from and how events are communicated, this is a really spectacular piece of work that was done here. And I'm going to just go back to my slides, share screen here. Sorry for that.
Thanks for sharing that. I hadn't seen that, so I'm going to look it up.
It's great. Yeah, it's really, really well done. And so I was digging around trying to figure out, where was Fort Lauderdale now? I have a friend who's down there, and he had experienced Ian also, and said that during Fort Lauderdale, as his roof was starting to come off again, and he was having some trauma from these multiple events hitting him. I'm looking at the scope of the event as Greg described, so I won't go into it, but I mean, really tremendous shutting down the airport, thousands of calls for help. And that was April 13th into, I guess, the 14th. And if you go search the news to see what's happening now, as of April 15th, the headlines are done. That's it for Fort Lauderdale. And the news media had packed up and had gone on to the next events. And as Greg said, they just keep coming. The weather just keeps coming. And we suddenly were paying attention to Vermont. And now paying attention, really sadly, to the Bucks County, Pennsylvania flooding and deaths that happened there just a few miles down the road from where I live here. And so when my final slide is just in thinking about how we talk about these events and the idea of people getting just their heads spun around by the new normal, there's a tremendous suite of data and forecast visualizations. There's tremendous opportunity for the media to be sharing information, and sometimes they don't share the right information, as we know. And with all of that, yet we know we're not fully reaching many of the most vulnerable and underserved communities with forecast information. And so there are researchers, including our team, who are working on studies to try to figure out what it is that the most vulnerable communities who really need in terms of forecast information. With all of that data out there, with all that coverage, what are the pieces that are really needed, and how do you get it to rural areas with low internet connection or places that don't have cultural habits of doing this? And so we have a study that we're working on doing that, hosting focus groups in various regions around the country and learning some tremendous things about communities that use social media and those that don't at all. And then what, right? That's a real game changer when we just encountered a community that nobody was on social media there whatsoever. So what do you do next? And the questions are complicated. So I just wanted to close with the thought that, the idea of normal weather seasons feels like it's changing. So if we're talking about weather normality, then does that become about sharing information as the new normal? Do we make normal our response and our preparedness and talk? There's not going to be normalcy in the seasons in the weather. We have to normalize getting ready for it and talking about it and sharing it in the best ways. So maybe that's the normal that we aim for.
Rachel,
I'm really
awesome.
interested in others' thoughts on that.
Yeah, and so let's keep sharing your screen here.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Oh, yep, I'll go back. Yep.
So let's have that up there. People can read it and reread it, and maybe they can again submit their questions or comments into the Q&A feature there at the bottom. As people are sort of formulating questions and chewing on all of this, here are a couple other sort of notable tidbits of why it's going to be memorable for the spring of 2023. Another point here, the onset of El Nino, not a lot of impacts per se, but it's the global pattern has shifted. It'll obviously impact hurricane season as that ramps up next month into September, and then far into the winter. Here locally, I think most of us, Greg, Rachel, and I are in the Mid-Atlantic states. Maryland and West Virginia saw a May snow, upwards of about 16 inches, I think, in some localized spots. Doesn't happen every year. The snowpack that Greg mentioned, obviously when you get into the spring and then into the summer, that snowpack melts. And we have seen pretty consistently these tragic stories of mostly recreation adventurers, whether they're kayaking or paddle boarding, but they're on the rivers. Those rivers are swollen, a little bit faster current, something that they may not have experience with in past years, as well as that water is extremely cold, obviously coming from melted snow. And we've seen a series of rescues and unfortunately fatalities. And then I'd be remiss not to mention this year and every year that we're still struggling with getting or reducing the rip current and beach surf fatalities. I think we're approaching 70 for 2023. That was even before, the peak holiday season, but we're really, we need to get all hands on deck in reaching out, getting into communities, not just at the coast, but even inland, as many of the victims of rip currents and sort of the near shore beach area, they're on vacation traveling from interior states. So it's a all hands on deck approach on that. All right, we've got one question here. The story, okay, it's Ted showing the link to the story map. So Rachel, I know WFO Miami thanks you on that end.
It was well done.
That's right. Any other questions, comments, experiences that one might have?
If I may, the vulnerability questions really interesting from the perspective of our own vulnerability. I mean, I feel very vulnerable now with respect to the smoke. This was an event that I hadn't really given a lot of thought to in the past. I've been involved in severe weather for, I think Gideon gave me credit for 20 years. It's actually been more like 30, but the risks that I've been dealing with are severe storms, tornadoes, hail, wind, flooding, winter weather. Smoke was not on my radar. And even to the extent that I went out in that weather, and then later regretted it because I did not feel well afterward, and have recently been reading about the dangers that this 2.5 particulate matter poses to human health. It's incredibly dangerous and it's pervasive. Unless you're inside with filtered air, you are at risk of health concerns from the smoke. So this is kind of I hate to say it, but I mean, this is kind of a new one on the scene, right? We've been dealing with how to better communicate hazards with regard to severe weather and flooding and other meteorological factors, even in the presence of climate change. But smoke is a new one for me, and it's visceral. It's right there. It was here yesterday in the Mid-Atlantic. I guess it's letting up a little bit today. It'll be back, and I think Air Now, I think their website, we got to give them credit. I mean, they were ready for this. It was there. It's not like somebody had to cobble this together very quickly based on reaction. Air quality has been monitored for a while, but it's not necessarily been at the top of the list of things that we worry about. And it has now come up to be a very significant hazard that we all are aware of, as Rachel said. But again, the Air Now website is amazing. I think it's very easy to navigate. They even have a color colorblind option there, which is wonderful. We often hear a lot of the Weather Service graphics are not conducive to folks with color vision issues, and they've got this ability to switch the colors on that website. So whoever's doing that, we should probably recognize them for being ready and having a resource that we could all utilize to try to understand a little bit better what our risk is.
Good points, Greg. And Rachel, if you don't have a follow-up response to that, we do have a second question here, and it's a bit long, but I'll boil it down. A great point John makes here. The long-standing tradition that TV meteorologists really only have a couple of minutes to present their weather forecasts, and it's really hard to dive into some of these more nuanced points and the connections to the climate and our vulnerabilities in our communities. And so are there any ideas of, especially looking at Rachel there, more properly communicating those impacts and those sort of the weather climate connection by the media?
So repeatedly, when we do focus group testing with forecast products, one of the things that people will say, and we just heard this in a focus group last week, in fact, was I believe it was a flood warning or something that was describing the meteorology of what was going to happen. Right, a system's coming through; it's going to dump this much rain on these areas, et cetera. And the reaction was, "Well, what are we supposed to do? I want someone to tell me what to do." And that's what I was starting to reflect on with this idea at the end about the idea of what is it that we're going to normalize is the role of media in the role of forecasting and the role of communities that are trying to get themselves resilient to be really talking more about the response that is needed in a moment and how to handle the impacts. And that's something that isn't always the front and center. First is the description of how much rain is going to come, what's going to happen, but what do we do about it? And I feel like that's a piece of the story that needs to get raised up into the conversation a little bit more. Just throw that out as one angle as an answer to that question.
I'll pass along just a comment that I've been making in some interviews regarding the flooding rain. Is people are aware of where they live. They're probably aware to some extent of their vulnerability to flash flooding. I think when we're in regimes like this where the weather's relatively active, it helps to remind folks to be cognizant of their surroundings and know that there is a risk that they may encounter some extreme rain. If they're driving, for example, you may encounter extreme rainfall today. Don't try to take cover in an underpass or where the road dips. Try to avoid intersections that flood. Better yet, maybe don't drive during the afternoon or evening hours when the rainfall likelihood is greater. Although that's easy to say, it's not easy to do for some folks. But just an awareness of one's potential vulnerability in the presence of an extreme weather event, I think could go a long way to, hopefully having folks take the right actions, make the right decisions. And if you live in the presence of a stream or a river that is known to flood, be prepared for that potential outcome and be prepared to take action to get yourself to higher ground and be safe. So I was trying to put that in the interviews that I've been doing recently, is to just be aware of your surroundings and be aware that you might be dealing with a day of enhanced risk due to extreme rainfall.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly mention, and it may be something either for a follow-up webinar because I think it's important, but or an article or some sort of response to this conversation. But Joe Ripberger, researcher at the University of Oklahoma, we've been working on a project using machine learning AI techniques to data collect what is being mentioned on air by TV meteorologists. And Rachel, to your point, the analysis has come back that they focus on the here and now, like the current temperature and what to expect weather-wise. A lot less mention of, okay, now that we know all of this, here's what we would like you to do in response to that. So that's something maybe that our enterprise can, pivot toward and improve upon. So thank you for that question, John. Again, don't be shy, reach out. We've got some time here. A question for Greg and Rachel. Yes, we're looking back on the spring, but we've alluded to a few things currently here in July. Obviously, the extreme heat's a biggie. One of the eye-raising reports recently was not only bathwater down in the South Florida, the Florida Keys area, but borderline hot tub temperatures, almost reaching 98 degrees. That's eye-catching. Are we it'll be interesting how the hurricane season unfolds with the impacts of El Nino, but those water temperatures are sky high.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion right now trying to understand exactly what's going on here. I think it might be the first season that I've heard the phrase ocean heat wave. We've heard about heat waves. We usually think about them over the land areas of the West or Southern U.S., but ocean heat waves now seem to be occurring across much of the Atlantic. The temperatures are really hard to get your head around. I mean, they are far off the scale of what we've seen in the past, and they're contributing to the challenges we have on land. I mean, the fact that you have record heat index values occurring in Miami is a direct result of the fact that the water isn't cooling things off very much. It's hot, 95 degrees off the Keys. I mean, that's unheard of. And there are some theories about the breakdown of the trade winds due to the position of the subtropical high, perhaps contributing to that. And the fact that you have the subtropical high in place, you have a lot of solar insolation, and the fact that water has it's slow to change in temperature. So now that it's up so high, there's a genuine concern that it's going to stay there for a while. It's not going to cool off very soon. So this is this the new normal? I hate to think that it's not normal. It's just not normal at all. And the ramifications of it are beginning to be seen in terms of the heat, the persistence of the heat index down there. And as you mentioned, Doug, I'm trying not to stay awake at night worrying about what happens once we get more active tropical weather in the presence of such available fuel. I mean, that's hard to imagine what actually could happen with that. And again, hurricanes and tropical storms act as Earth's air conditioners. So at some point, you're going to have a supercharged air conditioner to move that heat out of the equatorial and tropical regions and toward the poles. Let's hope it does it over the ocean.
No, great points. And then, Rachel, maybe, combining the previous comments and Greg's comments here to a question we have: to what extent does it seem like this year's weather patterns will be characteristic of weather patterns in the future due to climate change? Was any of it unexpected based on current climate models?
I'd say probably Greg is better equipped to talk about what is expected weather-wise, except that to say that the public's narrative storyline has been that to expect the unexpected and to expect extremes to be percolating. And people are starting to say it feels like extremes are percolating. So the news media, as we were talking about, always hops on to whatever is the biggest and the baddest thing that's happening. And that is so frequently now the weather. The news stories, if you just start, studying the headlines for that. So it's consistent with what has been told. And as we're talking about that, the conversation that I hear in my own life with people who think that I know something about the weather is about, well, is it just going to be like this forever? And I think I just keep coming back to this last bullet here about, like, what are we supposed to do? How do we live if it's always going to be unpredictable? What is the way that we're supposed to be? So one of the conversations that's happened a lot in the focus groups that we have is that the idea of understanding forecasts, understanding forecast information, being able to read that kind of scientific information needs to be part and parcel of the education systems, right? That's part of basic citizen literacy at this point, is to know what a hydrograph is, to have seen one, to be able to read it, to be able to understand a data chart that tells you various pieces of information. And it feels like a talking point I want to keep hammering home in various places, is that we need to expect that kind of literacy and normalize that kind of literacy in order to, navigate where we are.
I'm sure for every extreme event, you probably you generate any number of future meteorologists. So that might be one benefit of the extreme events. As far as the predictability or the future state, I do think that this is hopefully, a positive thought here might be that, these things are episodic, and that you might end up, we might get into October. Let's see the shear across the Atlantic suppresses tropical cyclone development, and we don't have a very busy hurricane season. Things start to cool down a little bit, maybe get the fires under control, and you could go into a period of relatively tranquil weather. So I think it's important for us to understand that, we're not really sure what's next. Nobody told me in December last year that you're going to be dealing with extreme rainfall, like the likes of which, similar to Irene in parts of the Northeast. Oh yeah, and by the way, you'll be choking on bad air quality too, because there'll be widespread wildfires in Canada. So these things are inherently difficult to predict. Once they're underway, it's a little bit easier to, once you're in the pattern, like we have been the past month or so, it's a little easier to basically prepare for what might be expected given that pattern. I'm hopeful that, again, it doesn't lock in like this. We will see changes, and hopefully some of those changes will bring relief.
Yeah, and so Greg, just kind of, before we get to our next question, and that may wrap the webinar up, could you provide your perspective, your thoughts, 30 years of experience on, how the weather enterprise, how our forecasts are really doing a better job of identifying, the extreme rainfall event, the outliers, where maybe 10, 15 years ago, even if our models and guidance kind of pointed to an extreme event, the forecaster themselves wouldn't necessarily believe it or trust it as much as they do now. Events like Harvey come to mind, where, the guidance is outstanding and indicating things we've never really seen before.
Yeah, especially in the relatively short range. Like I said, once a pattern becomes established, I think we're relatively confident in what that means for sensible weather. The events in Vermont are very interesting. There's a lot of sensitivity up there now to any rainfall, and we had an event on Saturday or Sunday into Monday of additional rainfall up there. And we were providing decision makers and emergency managers up there with reasonable worst case scenario. Now, part of the challenge was there are a lot of players in this space, and I believe there were some forecasts that were out that were quite exceptional at the high end with respect to rainfall, which created a lot of concern. Using science, we were able to basically provide decision makers with a range of possibility. This is the least amount you can expect. This is what we're forecasting. Here's a worst case scenario that some of the models are suggesting you could see this much. And we provided them that information. And actually, I went back almost the same day, as soon as I had observed data, and I put that data on those plots. and we did pretty well. We actually, the forecast amounts came out about as we expected, and there was no sensationalizing this information. It was just, this is what you can expect as far as rainfall. Be ready for the, potential for more than that. But overall, the forecasts were remarkable. I mean, and again, you mentioned it. A few years ago, this would have been unheard of. And we've seen this in a couple of events this summer. Extreme rainfall has been predicted incredibly well, especially when you look at a range of possibility. You don't look at a single model and say, well, that's what we're going with. You look at a number of different models in an ensemble, and that can provide you a probabilistic approach to understanding what the forecast might be. Yeah, I mean, the changes that we've been able to see in the science, and again, I think the communication part remains a challenge, but the changes we've seen in our ability to predict are remarkable.
Could I follow that briefly, Doug, to say that that even in 12 years of doing this work, the change in the communication has also been remarkable. I think that there has been a really concerted effort to improve how these kind of events are communicated. And I've seen a dramatic improvement of that. And what's interesting is that the role of the individuals in the forecast and the trust in the forecasters is really, really high. So the end users who are getting these extreme precipitation rainfall events that sound insane may have a really difficult time visualizing what 55 inches of rain is going to do. But when we go to focus groups, if the forecaster tells them on social media that that's what's going to happen, they have very high confidence that that's what's going to happen, right? So that's not the problem. There is strong confidence often from the users. Now, there may be a disconnect between what am I supposed to do with that information? How do I prepare for that? And what is that really going to mean for my house, which is a separate challenge, right? And that's where we try to step in a little bit. But I think that growth in science capability and also the communication of it, and then the verification of it, the ground truthing by everyone experiencing the forecast has happened together.
No, that's great. And I kind of harp on that point in my day job of, it's one thing forecasting the weather, highlighting, these extreme events happening, but what does an individual, what does a business, what does a community do with that when you're talking, maybe never seen before rainfall totals or rainfall rates. Right. And, Greg, I always get nervous on the, once every 1,000-year recurrence interval, because what happens. People think, oh, phew, we're not going to see that for another few hundred years at least, but it could happen, next week.
Yeah, not the way the weather works.
That's right. That's right. Mother Nature does not work with recurrence intervals.
Although we're working to improve those.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So a second question from John here. I appreciate you submitting these. And this actually came through my Twitter feed as well. Very discouraging. But a weather forecaster in Iowa quit his job due to receiving threats because he was mentioning climate change in his forecast. Is this something that is now going to hinder good work in meteorology? Greg, Rachel, kind of chew on this. I guess my immediate response would be, unfortunately, I don't think this is a isolated case. And certainly, we have a long history of some people, responding very inappropriately to climate change stories. I do see, in my own experience, a lot more chatter, a lot more stories on climate change and connecting, current extreme weather to the climate impacts. Anyways, thoughts on this last question?
So it's not gonna hinder me personally. I feel sorry for that individual, and it's an unfortunate situation. Working closely with the broadcast meteorology community for years, there's an incredible dedication to professionalism and science in that community. There are great interactions across the board with respect to utilizing the best of the science to communicate risk. We're in the business of trying to protect lives and property, and I'm not going to have somebody stop me from doing that because I'm basically using science to communicate.
And I'll sound maybe like a repetitive drum here on this point, but how we talk about those events is going to matter a lot about how the messaging is received. And if we are talking about how to live safely in the environment where we are, and how we are supposed to be responding to these kinds of events with action statements, and emphasizing the community response to it, I think those are pieces of information that everyone gathers around. So everyone experiences weather as it's happening. Everyone has to come and deal with it. And so I think if we can really start to have this conversation about what are communities doing to prepare to respond, what are the safety actions that we need to do, it is a uniting framework for this. I echo everything that he said otherwise, but just adding that additional piece of information there about what does unite people in the conversation, and that seems to.
I will mention there was an opinion piece in the New York Times yesterday regarding the politics. This is about politics. This is about making decisions regarding who you want in positions of power with respect to making policy that might make the world a better, safer place. There's a lot of debate about that, but there's also overwhelming scientific evidence that we need to be making changes if we want to see things improve. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let the slings and arrows fly.
Yeah, and then I know, Rachel, you brought up education. I think that when the younger generations are looking at these news stories on climate, they're learning more about climate. They're developing, they're strengthening their critical thinking skills where their mind has not been made up. Some people will get someday we'll see a high temperature of 150 degrees, and there'll still be people who don't believe in climate change. But it's the younger generation, that connection to the educational system, I think is also extremely important. Deep breath. Thank you. All right, there are no more questions. We are just about to the top of the hour. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Greg. I knew this was going to happen. It was going to be a lightning fast hour of conversation, and I thank you both, and I thank everybody attending today.
Thanks. Great to be
Thanks,
with you.
Doug. Yep. Good to see you, Rachel.
You too, Greg. See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.